Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Resuming Debate podcast, where we talk about political issues nationally within Canada, globally, as well as various philosophical issues that are of interest to me and hopefully of interest to you as well. One of the biggest things filling your news feeds right now is, of course, the war in the Middle East. This is something that I wanted to talk about and was thinking, what are some different lenses we could bring to this discussion? One angle that I've been following with great interest has been the Vatican's engagement on this, as well as discussions about just ideas of just war. In terms of Vatican engagement, the Pope has been quite vocal in calling for a ceasefire and a resumption of dialogue. I find this personally interesting as a Catholic myself, and also someone who sees these issues in slightly different terms, in terms of the practical and prudential issues going on in the conflict. I also think that the engagement of an American Pope on public policy issues being debated in the United States creates an interesting dynamic in terms of religious and political life here in North America. So to talk about Catholic ideas of just war, some of the Vatican's engagement on these issues and the implications for kind of that interplay between American politics and global action. I'm very pleased to be joined by Rusty Reno from First Things Magazine, a voice that some of you will certainly recognize from all of their work. Rusty, thanks so much for taking the time to join my podcast today.
A pleasure to be with you.
You've written about this in the context of especially the Iran war and some of the other debates happening in the United States. I wonder if you could just give our audience a bit of a preliminary on just war theory. What are the criteria? Why is it important in terms of assessing whether or not a decision to go to war is just?
Well, there are two aspects of just war theory. There's the jus ad bellum, to use the Latin, the principles regulating when it is just or proper to go to war, and then jus in bello, which is the criteria for just prosecution of war. And the Catholic tradition has a very well developed and I think important and useful and correct set of criteria to by which to assess war, going to war, and the prosecution of war. So, jus ad bellum, you have just cause, probability of success, last resort, proper authority. Am I missing one there? Yeah, I think that's it. So, justice of the cause, that's a multifaceted way of trying to think about that. Also proportionality. So, last resort, negotiations, whatever. You can't just rush into war. Proportionality. You don't. If there's a border dispute, you don't sort of bomb the capital to smithereens. And so I think that those are probability of success is important also. I think the idea of kind of heroic but futile war making is ruled out in the just war tradition. And then jus in bello, this has to do with both proportionality and non-combatant immunity. You can't target civilians, and again, you don't flatten the city in order to knock out some aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. So let's pick up on a few pieces of that. One thing just to clarify is that the nature of this criteria is that all of them have to be met, right? It's not like if you get 75%, that's pretty good, right? You have to have the just cause and the just means, and it's if you have a just cause but you're using unjust means, that's still not allowed.
Right, but I think the jus in bello, in other words, the just prosecution of war, is pretty widely. I mean, those non-combatant immunity, That I think is the United States military has taken on board um, in the post World War II and certainly in the post Vietnam era. It's taken on the jus in bello criteria, and I think part of the reason for doing so has to do with both political viability of a conflict, the morale of troops, and then thirdly, the technological changes that allow for much more precise targeting. And
Hmm.
and so that's
Do you think
pretty.
that consensus is pretty stable, or are there people putting
I th-
pressure on that consensus?
I'm sure there's always because these are not these have to do with, like, for instance, non-combatant immunity doesn't mean that you refrain from taking action that will lead to civilian deaths, because you have the principle of double effect, and that is that you use your cruise missile and try to make the targeting precise, but you foresee that uh, there can obviously be civilians that are nearby and are killed. Moreover, your enemy often can exploit civilians as shields, and there's no. It's not like a recipe book, where you measure out the ingredients and then everything's all just
Right.
set. Instead, these moral principles are meant to guide judgment
Hmm.
rather than be a kind of checklist.
Yeah. So you mentioned general consensus around the prosecution questions. I guess maybe where you were going is there's less consensus around uh, the application of those just war criteria on when to and not to go to war. One thing that's jumped out at me from the discussion is, um, from what I understand, the American Constitution sort of envisions congressional declarations of war, and that has effectively stopped happening for ever since Second World War. So some people challenge the idea that it's legitimate or correct authority because
Yes,
there's no congressional declaration of war.
right. I mean, you're right, and I had left out in Jus ad bellum. There's also the principle of legitimate authority. So war making is not the prerogative of paramilitary organizations, or anybody can just sort of get a private army and go to war. Somebody has to be responsible, so to speak. And you're quite correct. The United States has been in on a wartime. United States military has been engaged in actions on a pretty continuous basis since the end of World War II, but there's been no declaration of war. The the, uh, and this has uh, been a source of uneasiness for many constitutional scholars in the United States. Uh, and so, in the aftermath, or maybe it was during the Vietnam War, the War Powers Act requires the President of the United States has the authority to deploy the United States military in action, but after 60 days of conflict, the president's required to get authorization from Congress. So, strictly speaking, Trump is functioning under existing U.S. law in terms
Hmm.
of this current war-making activity. I think if we want to digress here, I think I would put it this way: the the U.S. has functioned as an imperial power since the end of World War II, and in the maintenance of this empire, it's just not feasible. It requires a very plastic and open-ended deployment of force, or the
Hmm.
threat of force. And so I think the lawmakers in the United States and our political leaders recognized fairly early on in the 1950s that the United States would not be able to proceed under the strict, we're either at war or not at war. We're much more in the Roman situation where we have frontiers, and those frontiers require a kind of open-ended, uh, hot and cold application of force or threat of force in order to maintain, first in the Cold War context, and then in the post-Cold War context, it became even more expansive, and I think
Yeah.
probably the U.S. has kind of been continuously at war since 1989. I would put it that way. We've been on a wartime footing since, put it
Yeah.
that way, since
Yeah.
1989. I don't like that, actually,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't like our imperial posture, although I recognize that it's very difficult to avoid given how powerful the United States is in the global system. So I'm reluctant to morally criticize our leaders, even as I look at our political form as a republic and fear that the empire is going to swallow the republic, or may already have swallowed the republic.
Hmm. Yeah. So I think that's really interesting things to think about and talk about.
Yeah,
From the
because let's
purposes of just war, I suppose it.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
if you look at it, it is very difficult, and I don't think that the just war criteria become irrelevant by no means, but their application becomes difficult because the in a in this kind of imperial situation that there's no clear line between a police action and a war. And notice how the Trump administration described this as a, I don't know, they kind of used the same terminology Putin did. I can't remember exactly what the term was, but it was something like a special military operation with respect to Iran. So at the outset, the Trump administration was reluctant to use the word war.
Hmm.
And
But it seems for very different reasons and in very different contexts, right? I mean, part of the argument, part of the way the argument is framed domestically, it seems to me in the U.S. emerges out of this real reluctance within part of Trump's coalition to support foreign wars of any kind. So this is, in the context of a real desire to distinguish from past events that may or may not be that different. Is that true?
also, I think there was an effort not to raise the constitutional question about whether
Yeah.
the president is authorized to launch wars without congressional approval. I also think there are probably various people in the administration anxious about what remains of the old kind of liberal world order and its
Hmm.
rule-based approach to war making. George H.W. Bush was um, very keen and very meticulous about gathering all of the necessary international approvals, the United States, UN Security Council authorization to go to war to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. Um, Ever since then, the U.S. there's been a kind of slow decline in concern about getting international authorization. And whether that it's a chicken and egg question, what has the U.S.'s increasing disinterest or lack of concern about that caused a decline in the authority of these international rules, or have the rules kind of just weakened over the last 30 years to such a degree that they just are no longer relevant? So an interesting question, and I can't say I can answer it,
Yeah.
but I do think that makes even more complicated and difficult to answer the just cause. Uh,
Yeah.
UN Security Council authorizes U.S. military, and in fact, there's a big show about it being a coalition and not just the U.S. military to go to war against Iraq in 19 when was that 91 or 1990? I can't remember exactly.
Yeah.
The first Gulf War. Uh, that was it was like it was both legally and he had invaded, although Pat Buchanan opposed in the United States us going to
Hmm.
war in the first Gulf War on the grounds that Kuwait was not an ally, and we had no material interest. If Saddam Hussein wanted to invade Kuwait, that was the Kuwaitis' problem and its neighbors' problem, not our problem. But that was, I think, an expression of an early version of skepticism about the U.S. empire after the end of the Cold War.
Yeah. And I guess part of the context too was, I mean, where were the other uh, veto wielding members of the Security Council? I mean, right now we're in a context where the Iranian regime is militarily supporting the Russian invasion of Ukraine through the supply of these Shahed drones, like the idea of the UN Security Council impartially evaluating evidence that might or might not be brought on Iran. So that's the question of lawful authority. I did want to pick up on one other point in the initial explanation: this idea of reasonable probability of success versus sort of the often viewed heroism of fighting for a lost cause. So on these grounds, if you take a very depending on how you apply this idea of reasonable probability of success, like Thermopylae was a mistake. Leonidas should have looked at the Persian army and said, not
But it worked.
happening.
But
But
it
it worked
worked.
in a sense, yeah. So
Yes, it doesn't mean
so
that a general can't. I mean, again, this is kind of. But I would say this that, and I wrote about this. In the first year after first year of the Ukrainian-Russian war, Ukraine was doing pretty well, and I wrote about this, and I would say that I would if I were advising the Ukrainian government, I would be advising them this is the time to rush towards a ceasefire and try to get a peace deal, because it's just always struck me very unlikely that there's a very low probability of success of the Ukrainians pushing the Russians back to pre-war borders. And so if that's the case, it becomes because the idea of just war is to try to minimize the war, the damage and harm done by war making. And because the ultimate aim of war has to be peace. You want to reestablish peace, and you can't you can't always hold out for the best possible outcome.
yeah, I mean, I suppose
Otherwise, we'll fight forever because there's never
yeah,
sort of,
yeah.
if you will, the perfect situation.
Yeah. So that's the principle. I mean, prudentially, in the case of Ukraine, I think a lot of people would counter that, like the problem with a temporary ceasefire is if that's associated with significant sanctions released for Russia, the enhancement of their ability to develop their capacity to attack again, and the result of it isn't peace, but merely a temporary reprieve. So I guess these discussions also should draw us to think about what does peace look like in a broader, deeper, more permanent sense, and maybe then maybe if what's on the table is simply a short-term ceasefire, then you make the calculation you're better off fighting now. But of course, I mean, nations have to take into consideration these prudential realities, right? You can't expect perfect justice this side of heaven, right? The just war theory invites us to make these prudential calculations and say what's actually viable here.
Yeah, I think that World War II really, I think, perverted the moral imagination of the West because it created you have the exception becomes the rule. Like, for instance, Franklin Roosevelt insisted on the doctrine of unconditional surrender, which I think is an immoral doctrine, because it and probably did a certain amount of harm in the final months. I mean, many people died unnecessarily in the final months of the European war, the European theater of World War II, because of the doctrine of unconditional surrender. But the counter argument to unconditional surrender was exactly yours, which is that it was a way of really the cancer had to be cut out, and look at the results. The results were actually no war in Europe since 1945, with the exception of the Balkans, and so it's but that could have been a one-off situation or a very rare situation. And I get very nervous when the notion of unconditional surrender is bandied about, especially in this current conflict with Iran. It would be nice if the regime fell. I think that would be a wonderful outcome for the Iranian people and for the region. But, yeah, unconditional surrender, that's a recipe for total war. And total war, I think, is not, I think it's, almost always runs afoul with, I think, the kind of moral wisdom that is contained in the just war tradition.
Hmm. I mean, the history around the Second World War is fascinating. It's an interesting argument to say that, but I think taking into consideration both sides, on the one hand, what would the alternatives have been? I mean, there were uh, uh, there's a great book that I think I've recommended before, Church of Spies, that talks about the interesting role the Vatican, coming back to that,
Hmm.
played trying to facilitate negotiations between the Allies and the anti-Nazi German opposition, with the idea that a coup within Germany could lead to the end of Nazi rule, and that would be followed by negotiations. And um, I think it's reasonable to speculate that had the Valkyrie plot or other things attempted earlier, had they succeeded, that the unconditional surrender demand would have changed.
I don't think so. I think Roosevelt, he he had in mind the destruction of Germany as a global power in order to usher in U.S. dominance, global dominance.
Hmm.
I mean,
Um,
I just think he was a very that was his calculation, but these are all very speculative.
yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
but I think it's useful to entertain these speculations because yeah I I I'm very my moral radar starts beeping loudly when people talk about some sort of, to use that language, some sort of final solution to the conflicts in the Middle East. Beware final solutions.
Hmm.
Um, the part of our moral duty is to try to make bring the most justice and the greatest possible peace to a fallen world, not to try to sort of, if you will, break through to a world that where we don't have to make lots of compromises.
Hmm. So let's the logical place to go from that comment is to getting more specific about the situation in Iran.
Mm.
It's been interesting for me to see some of the debate around the application of just war by American commentators, because it seems that all of them, or most of them, are focusing on this question of imminent threat to the United States, which is, um, seems to me, sort of the harder argument to make. The easier argument to make in defense of the justness of this war is the defense of the Iranian people, who I think we have good evidence to believe are overwhelmingly opposed to the regime. You go to the rallies and look at them, kind of the pro and anti-intervention rally. The pro-intervention side of the rally always have large numbers of people from the Iranian diaspora, and they're completely absent from the anti side of those rallies. I mean, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of protesters were killed in Iran in recent weeks by the regime. It seems clear to me that that's sort of the immediate trigger of this
Uh,
intervention, and
no,
that's so. Yeah.
I don't
Well,
like
well.
that argument because that's an argument for. With that argument, you have a kind of license to launch wars around the world. I mean, there are many unjust governments globally. I don't want. I don't. I would be very concerned if the president of the United States thought that he was morally justified in invading Cuba, for instance, or something like that, just on the grounds that it was an unjust government and he was doing a favor to the people of Cuba or doing a favor to the people of Iran. I don't discount it as a factor, but I would not put that the leading factor.
The leading factor for the administration, or the leading
The leading,
factor in
I don't think it
in
was the
providing
leading
a moral
factor.
justification?
I don't,
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not talking
and I
so
don't
much
like
about.
moral justifications that are not. I mean, I would want to know what is the intention of the administration and ask whether it's a just intention.
Okay.
And I think the intention of the administration, I think the stymieing the nuclear program is, in fact, a major intention of the administration. That is, I think. Um,
Mhm.
I mean, regime change, better world, better country for the people. I'm sure that's a factor. Um, Defending an ally, Israel, from uh, a nation that's been a kind of proxy war with Israel for decades, and for that matter, proxy war against the United States. Um, is a plausible. It's a plausible purpose as well. That's where I would go. So we're kind of defending an ally, where, and then we have this very difficult question: is the United States justified in military actions that sustain its global hegemony? That's a really interesting question, and not easy one to answer, I think. But I think that's also obviously a factor here in the administration's thinking.
Yeah.
We have the Iran, China, Russia triangle, and this is, this becomes kind of like the Korean War or the Vietnam War. It's a battle in a larger geopolitical struggle, and and how do we think about that morally? Because that just it descends so quickly into kind of power politics. It's hard
So
hard to parse.
Yeah. So I think that there's a lot there, and I do want to circle back to kind of the argument I was making about just war on the grounds of defense of the Iranian people. But let's pick up on something you were just talking about, which is kind of assessing the motivations of the administration and calculations of a just war being based on motivations as well as the facts on the ground. So my understanding of the just war doctrine is that the motivation matters. The plan you have matters for determining whether it's a just war. If you undertake a war that might otherwise be just or is potentially just, but if you do it for wrong motives, then it's not a just war. At the same time, in a democracy where political coalitions govern us instead of singular ideologies, you're going to have complex motivations, mixed motivations. The reasons why a particular member of the U.S. administration wanted to see this intervention might well be very different from the reasons why another member of that administration does. And you talked about kind of different motives, potentially concern for the well-being of the Iranian people, potentially concerns about the imminence of an Iranian regime threat to the United States, concerns about impact on allies, about the strategic relationships with other powers. How do you assess just war, the application of just war doctrine when you have mixed motives, uncertain motives, different motives for different actors?
I would focus more on intent, I guess, which you can. I mean, you're right. The motives are very mixed, but an intention is more objective in the sense you can see it in terms of what the war making is aiming towards. Yeah, so we'll see if are there going to be commandos that go to the nuclear site or something like that, and then we'll have then it'd be easier to say, well, then this war is focused on, or the intent is to prevent Iran from attaining nuclear weapons, as opposed to, like for instance, people would argue that, the second Gulf War was about U.S. The motive or the intent was to gain control of Iraq's oil or something like that, which never struck me as a plausible explanation, or given what the United States actually did. So yeah, we have to look at that. But I would agree with you. I mean, motive is not irrelevant. I mean, if the motive is to buttress domestic support in the upcoming midterm elections, that would be a grotesquely immoral reason to launch a war. And fortunately, all the evidence would suggest the opposite. That is to say, initial indications are this is not going to help Republicans or the Trump administration in the upcoming midterm elections. There's some kind of breathe a sigh of relief. Well, at least this war is not being launched for the cynical purpose of improving one's political standings domestically, thankfully.
Do you want to speculate about? I mean, obviously there's different actors, but the president himself would have had to approve this decision. Obviously, what do you have any reflections on what might be the kind of animating among a range of possible motives, the animating one for him personally.
I do think that this issue about nuclear capacity
Mm-hmm.
is very much on the mind of on the White House's mind. Has been on. This has been a bipartisan thing. I think this was a concern for Obama and Biden, as well as for Trump, and different means were used. You have a kind of good cop, bad cop kind of thing going on in our relations with Iran ever since the hostage crisis in 1979. So, but I do think that's been very prominent in the thinking of the administration. Um, I think there, I think there's probably thought about the need to take a strong stand in order to buttress U.S. Um, the credibility of U.S. Deterrence, both in the Straits of Taiwan and then in Ukraine. That to me is a very dangerous gamble, because if this whole operation turns out to be unsuccessful, and a kind of false victory is declared, and he backs out in the next week or two, that the credibility of U.S. deterrence will decline dramatically rather than improve. But even that too, I think that's also very morally kind of, we go to war in order to increase the credibility of our threat and therefore increase the power of deterrence. That's like, it seems to me, that's a labyrinth of moral reflection that very difficult to see how that all adds up as a legitimate reason to go to war.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess,
So
this mires us in the difficulty of thinking about. Typically people say just war. The obvious case: your country's invaded and you repel the invader. Ukraine's a good example, obviously, and but it gets muddy, extremely muddy, I think, in when you are dealing with a kind of empire situation and threats to because in what sense is the empire sort of America? It's not really America, although it's American interests. But in fact, that's actually that's the growing, and I think it will continue to become even more pronounced, political debate in our country about whether or not our vast military and alliance commitments are in fact in the interests of our nation. Um, so what is America's national interest? Turns out to be a very difficult question to actually answer, because you'll answer it differently according to these growing political divides,
yeah.
both on the right and the left.
Yeah. So let's circle back to that if we have time. I'm going to try again to make my case for and get your feedback on it. This idea of, like, my basic belief about this is that the intervention is just on the grounds of protection of the innocent.
Mhm.
And I think it's important to distinguish between saying, okay, there's a government with a political system we don't like. There are plenty of examples of countries with political systems that we might not like, that are that are even U.S. allies in some cases, right? The issue with the regime in Iran is the persistence of just flagrant violence against the innocent, the the slaughter of protesters. Also violence against the innocent and enabling of such violence in other countries beyond Iran's borders. The collaboration with Hamas and Hezbollah and various militias in other places. But I don't know why defense of the innocent outside of the borders should be any more of a reasonable justification than defense of the innocent within a country's borders. In principle, if we believe in human dignity, like, the people in Iran are not the property of the regime. They are human beings like you and I are, and I think the rejoinder could be, well, doesn't that justify intervention always and everywhere? Well, I guess the response to that is these prudential considerations that you've brought up, right? If I see my neighbor abusing his children, I will try to intervene, but my decision to intervene will be affected a little bit on by prudential considerations. Can I intervene? Do I have the means to intervene? Maybe and depending on what seems within my capacity prudentially, that might impact my response. But I will still do what I can to try to protect an innocent person who's under attack. If you believe in the principle of self-defense or defense of one's own countrymen, there are obviously lots of practical reasons why that has to take precedence. But at a moral level, it seems that the same justifications would apply to protect an innocent person somewhere else. What do you think about that?
I mean, that's the kind of that got formalized in the responsibility to protect doctrine of
Yeah.
liberal internationalism in the aughts. I mean, obviously, it has moral weight, and I don't want to deny that. I wish only to to caution against the its tendency to become a kind of plenary justification for war making. Would it? I mean, if the Iranian regime falls, we have ample cause to celebrate on behalf of, as you say, the prospect of a better life for innocent people, not only in the country but broadly in the Middle East, because there are Iran sponsors a whole bevy of proxy forces that foment violence and I mean the Lebanese are afflicted with dysfunctional politics because of the existence of Hezbollah. So I think the Iranians have done a lot of evil in the region for a long time. So yeah, I'm persuaded that is a just cause. Yes, but I wish as an American, I'm very eager to restrain our use of military force rather than justify it. I would like it not. I would. When we use it, I would hope that it would be for a just cause. But I would like us to be as restrained as possible. And I think that in that sense, I agree with what Pope Leo is saying about negotiations and ceasefire. I mean, I defer to our political leaders, and that's one thing that Just War puts a lot of. It accords a great deal of scope because so many of the judgments are prudential. Probability of success, last resort. These are the people. You and I don't know enough probably to make some definitive judgment about whether or not the administration has violated or fulfilled those criteria. But I agree with Pope Leo. We should always, sort of give peace a chance, as they as they say. I'm a realist. I recognize that sometimes war making is necessary, but yeah, we should be careful. If possible, if the administration can be convinced that it can get the Iranians onto some kind of program to prevent, through negotiations and inspections, or at least delay significantly the nuclear program, I would think that would be, if I were advising the president, I would say, Mr. President, you should do that. You should take that option. And if somebody were to intervene and say, well, but they'll just get started up again 2 or 3 years later, I say, well, that's 2 or 3 years. 2 or 3 years, other things will happen.
I mean, I suppose
it's always good. It's always good for people not to die.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose and I mentioned this earlier in a different context, but the question of what peace looks like, right? Like if peace looks like non-intervention by the United States, but the continuing violence against the innocent, then but I want to let's dive in on this issue of what Pope Leo is saying. I mean, one interesting dynamic in American Vatican relations right now, it seems to me, is that you have an American Pope, a guy from Chicago, and you have Catholics in pretty prominent roles in the administration. The president isn't Catholic, but his vice president is. His Secretary of State is, and I think his wife is as well. So you've got an American Pope, and you've got Catholics holding significant offices in the United States. I mean, taking a step back from the current conflict for a second, I mean, how do you see a year into this papacy that playing out as maybe different from a situation in which they were in two separate worlds to a greater extent?
Well, I think that on the immigration issue, the Vatican is so hostile to a reversal of course throughout the West on mass migration that probably the Trump administration's already discounting what Catholic leaders have to say. And that's been the neuralgic issue.
Okay, so that's more defining in terms of U.S. domestic debates than the other.
I think so. Yeah, because Rome has sort of taken a view that the principle of human dignity just makes immigration control difficult to implement. So I mean, the Rome is, it's not stupid. They recognize the national right, even duty to control borders. But whenever it comes to any sort of controversial issue, it's always in favor of lax rather than strict enforcement. And so the Pope's going to go to Lampedusa for July 4th, to be in solidarity with migrants on the 4th of July, and which is obviously a direct effort it's a direct symbolic sort of counter to the Trump administration's policies. And the American U.S. Catholic bishops have filed an amicus brief in a case concerning birthright citizenship. People born in the United States have a right to be U.S. citizens. So they've really and they make that argument that sort of birthright citizenship flows as an absolute right directly from human dignity. But of course, there are many countries throughout the world that don't have birthright citizenship, but it's a very strange argument. So the church is really quite absolutist on migrant rights, or quasi-absolutist on migrant rights, and that's the biggest collision between Rome and the administration. I think Rome has been, I think the Pope Leo has been quite judicious on this war. I mean, he's calling for negotiations, ceasefire, and I find myself thinking, yes, that's what I would hope from our religious leaders. They should be on the side of peace, while recognizing that pacifism is unworkable as a doctrinaire position. But a presumption in favor of peace ought to be the message from our religious leaders.
So just to jump in on one other issue, I mean, I could probe the immigration issue, which is an interesting one, but that just to in terms of time, but it's interesting to hear your reflections on at least how the discussion around that has really kind of shaped and defined the conversation and the perception of each other. I noted that Pope Leo got involved in a debate about euthanasia or facilitated death within his state of origin, I think. So that's an issue where maybe he's more aligned with the quote unquote conservative side of the conversation in the U.S. Did that punch through, or was that kind of a blip in terms of public consciousness and the relationship that he's getting involved in that as a kind of life issue?
Yeah, I think the life issues, the church is well aligned with what you would call the kind of right-wing sentiment in the United States. Although even that, because of the way the current administration is all in on IVF, and so it's a complicated picture, actually, on on um, on life issues. Yeah,
Okay.
and I think
So
I would not be surprised if the Republican Party didn't flip to a kind of pro assisted suicide.
oh wow.
And that's just because that's what our elites want.
Huh.
And you see it, right now it's a blue state phenomenon, and there'll obviously be some red states that will continue to resist it. But the question is whether Republican elites are going to stay strong on the life issue. I think on abortion, um, uh, yeah, I don't see the Republican Party having any kind of significant plank on abortion going forward.
So jumping back to the war piece. So it's interesting your reading of the comments coming out of the Vatican as expressing a general preference for the pursuit of peace. Of course, I'm in agreement with the idea that we should seek peace, peace in the broadest sense, and peace for peoples, not just for nations. Um, I but I read the Vatican statements as more explicit, saying not only is peace desirable in general, but to pretty strongly imply, if not state, that the intervention was not justified. A sentiment that I don't agree with, and I'm sort of struck by the fact that there's not a lot of sort of specific discussion of just war. It seems to be more this general kind of like, well, um, we should always pursue peace and dialogue. Whether the just war, the concept of just war is there because there are cases where dialogue fails, and so it's interesting to me that you're reading their direction a bit different, because I was going to say it almost feels like an effort to push a kind of pacifist impulse, but it's reassuring
Well,
to hear that you're hearing something different out of that.
right. I mean, um, there's been I mean, as far as I know, nothing emanating out of the Vatican saying that this is an unjust war, although a great deal of um, exhortation to ceasefire, negotiation, um, general statements about not, negotiation, not war making, and all that kind of stuff. But so yes, uh, you know, the Vatican's been opposed to every American war, it seems to me, since the end of the Cold War. John Paul II spoke strongly against the Second Gulf War,
Hmm.
um, and uh, I think that the Catholic Church, in its official, although we continue, and the Catechism has the just war doctrine in it, I think the Catholic Church has been functionally pacifist um, since the end of World War II. I mean, we can't underestimate, I think, the traumas of World War II and the sense of the futility of warfare. And you read Gaudium et Spes from the Second Vatican Council, and there's a great hope that international institutions can supplant. I mean, this was a post-war, mid-20th century hope, is that these international institutions would provide a forum where we could get beyond a world in which where war making was necessary in order to maintain a modicum of justice in the global system.
Hmm.
And I think to this day, 2026, I mean, the United Nations was established in 1946, and so that's 80 years ago. But to this day, I think, I mean, Pope Benedict spoke of, I think, a world governing authority. So I do think that the Catholic leadership continues to harbor that hope. And so wars are kind of always a kind of threat or an impediment to the realizing. I would call it a utopian dream, but at least that's my read of Catholic leadership of the Catholic Church. I think it's like I understand it, and would that it could be true, but I don't think it's feasible. So we're back to this question of probability of success, and so it doesn't seem. And if it's not successful, then sort of the moral exhortations emanating from that sentiment, I wind up discounting.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me not based on a kind of moral assessment of what's actually going to be possible and what is necessary given the world we actually live in.
Yeah. So I guess the distinction between articulating an aspiration, right? Like where differences are always solved through dialogue, where there are functioning mediating structures that can resolve these issues, where universal human dignity is recognized and appreciated. That's like a very good aspiration, and I think it's worthwhile and important for that aspiration to be articulated, versus the practical advice to people like me who are really interested in hearing and learning from what the Vatican is proposing, but also are trying to answer the question of given the security threats to the world posed by the regime in Iran, and given the violence against the innocent inside Iran and beyond, it's always a good time to pray for the for the aggressors to mend their ways, but we must, as leaders, we must act, and we must protect ourselves, protect the people we govern, and protect the vulnerable. So there does seem to be a little bit of a tension, I guess, between those elements of ideals and practice. And this is what just war theory is supposed to resolve. It's supposed to provide us with a kind of a framework for working that out.
It seems to me that if at this level, world governing authority, if you will, the kind of United Nations dream, which I think has failed in post-Cold War. It failed during the Cold War, but even after the Cold War, it failed even more. And so I think my sense is that our moral duty of American leaders is to try to establish a stable global system of great power, cooperation, and competition. And I think, I look at this war about which I have grave misgivings, in part because it's not clear to me that this is going to destabilize this global system and lead to more conflict, or will it, if successful, remove a great source of agitation and instability from the system, and allow for sort of a Chinese, Russia, American kind of equilibrium to develop, where you and I and other people around the world can get on with life without living under the shadow of the threat of war. I mean, we can never be free from that, but with good leadership, always should be aiming towards, if you're making war, it should always be with some eye towards a stable and at least relatively just peace that can reign after the war's over. And I do hope that people in the White House are thinking along, have a plan, so to speak, by which we can get somewhere, whether it's bringing some end to the Ukraine war or avoiding a conflict with China over Taiwan. It's my hope that they're thinking about this war in a way that we can reach a point of greater stability and equilibrium, and we can get through the rest of this decade and maybe into the next one, in a global situation with lower level of tension and less of a specter of war.
So, as relative outsiders, I mean, you as someone who's not in government, me as someone who's in the government of a different country, we don't have access to all the information. The most we can say using the just war criteria is whether a war is potentially just.
Yes.
And we can describe something as potentially just with hope that there is a plan, that there is that the assessments have been done on chances of success, that and follow-up scenarios that that will contribute to more peace in the long run and not less.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we can. I'm not in the mood of condemnation. I think this war has these elements that we can see it as potentially a just enterprise, and let's hope that the outcome is a more stable and less stable world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm gonna ask you a good Canadian question to wrap this up here. You know, my country was significantly developed by the arrival of loyalists, people who honored their obligations to the crown by fleeing the American Revolutionary War. Your country was shaped by a group of rebels who wanted to pay lower taxes. How do you think the just war doctrine would apply to the American Revolution? Do you think it would be permitted or not?
I think permitted. Wars of liberation are a special case, so that it was a war to liberate oneself from, what was essentially deemed to be a foreign domination. I mean, this is similar to, effectively, it was a war of decolonialization. So yeah, I think it was just. I mean, the question is, yeah,
that justification maybe works for, let's say, indigenous peoples revolting against, but these were essentially English settlers that
you're here for a long time. It was more than 100 years, 150 years. You become a people. That was precisely the argument in the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. The famous second paragraph is the natural rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But the first paragraph is an argument that the colonists had become a people, and as a people could make a legitimate claim to self-governance.
And I suppose if you're looking at another part of the just war criteria is looking at alternatives, looking at whether dialogue could have resolved the differences. I mean, I think it's hard to argue that Americans were under tyranny. I guess that argument was made, but
That's hyperbolic. I agree with you.
Yeah. So is maybe, even if you accept, okay, the points you just made, could this not have been resolved maybe over a longer time horizon through dialogue and negotiation in pursuit of greater self? I mean, that's where Canada came from, right? It took us a bit longer, but we are now an independent country, and we got there without the disruptive and painful process of revolution.
True enough. This is a mysterious question about the good of sovereignty, the good of self-government, and to what extent, how important is it? In the modern era, it became it became a very important issue. So, post World War I and the emergence of the nations, the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the emergence of the various ethnic nations that we now take for granted in Central Europe, all arose out of a perceived moral imperative of self-governance. And, we Americans were the first to really dwell on that as the justification for the use of violence yeah, I mean, and as an American, I obviously have sympathy for that justification.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being a good sport on that. Anyways,
Although I love Canada too.
Yeah.
And I like
thank
Canadians
you.
to unlike President Trump, I'm not. I don't want Canada to become the 51st state. I like you guys the way you are.
Well, thank you. During President Trump's presidential campaigns, of course, there was the famous slogan, "Make America Great Again." There were a few people walking around in Canada with hats that said, "Make America Great Britain Again."
Yes, this is
Which is,
I like that. That's one of
yeah,
my friends in England in 2016 um, uh, gave me a T-shirt saying "Make America Great Britain Again,"
right,
and
yeah,
very clever. Uh, but well,
good application of the just war
we
principle.
live in an interesting time. You know, the 20th century is kind of ending. It's cast a long shadow into the 21st century. And I think all of our political cultures are in a state of turmoil and uncertainty because of that. And it's not clear either globally or domestically, it's not clear kind of what kind of societies we're going to have and our children and grandchildren are going to inhabit. Um, it's technological, it's cultural, mass migration. It's been a huge transformative effect. Um, I think we're entering a post-democratic age for all kinds of reasons. Maybe we have been in one for longer than am willing to admit. Uh, you know,
Hmm.
and obviously with the rise of China and so on, the geopolitical situation is quite dramatically transformed in the last couple of decades. And we definitely, I think the just war tradition, we need to recognize again, it's not a checklist that's easy, can apply, boom, 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 but provides indispensable, I think, moral guidelines for leaders as they try to navigate these very uncertain waters.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us, for elucidating that, and for hopefully helping our audience think a bit about some of these issues around the Iran war, and also, looking at examples from Thermopylae to the American Revolution, all the way to the present day. So really appreciate you taking the time.
Great to be on the podcast.
And so for folks listening, we publish these episodes every 2 weeks. We cover a broad range of topics. Sometimes we're very in the nitty gritty of the day to day of Canadian politics, and other times we're looking at things from a global or more philosophical angle. So please subscribe, leave reviews. We're on all the major podcast platforms. And we will be back with another great episode of the Resuming Debate podcast in 14 days.